Hello, my name is Sandro Galea. I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the Boston University School of Public Health. On behalf of our school, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Our public health conversations are an important part of all we do. They are meant to bring together our school community to engage with issues of consequence for health. Ours is a global community with 10,000 alumni in 115 countries. And the Zoom era, for many of its disadvantages, has allowed us the opportunity to make our programming accessible to alumni all over the world and across time zones as never before. This Alumni and Friends event is specifically designed to engage with a broader audience across the world. Public health knows no borders, neither does the challenge we are here to discuss. Climate change threatens the health and well-being of everyone on the planet. Addressing climate change is a fundamental responsibility of public health. Our school has long engaged with this issue, helping lead the response to it. Today will feature a discussion around some of the leading edge issues in the field. It was organized and led by Professor Greg Wallenius, the director of our growing program in climate and health, with our gratitude. We look forward to continuing the conversation with our alumni and friends from around the world. I would like to introduce our co-host for today's program, Joe Gatto. Joe is a dedicated advocate for public health and friend of the school. He understands the threats to human health posed by climate change and the degrading of Earth's natural systems. Following a distinguished career in finance, during which he was a partner at Goldman Sachs, he has dedicated most of his time to human and planetary health, serving as the chairman of the Planetary Health Alliance, the president of the National Alliance of Mental Illness Connecticut, and as a board member of Eco America. But perhaps most importantly, his daughter, Catherine, is a 2016 graduate of the school. Thank you, Joe, and over to you.
Thank you, Dean Galea. Good morning. As a proud BU parent, I'm pleased to welcome all alumni and friends joining today's very important conversation. Now, before introducing the panelists for today's program, I'm going to invite you all to watch with us the highlights of last week's Bicknell lecture. I think you'll enjoy it. There's a lot to learn. Thank you.
In a year of pandemic, 12 months on since I helped the Fletcher School close up and then many educational institutions in this area closed, we've learned something about how bad we are at responding to risks in plain sight. The pandemic was forewarned. The climate crisis is forewarned, and yet we seem to have trouble to be able to respond at speed and at scale. The pandemic has also ripped off the Band-Aid that was barely at all covering the great deeping wound of inequality within our societies. And before the pandemic had really hit, the two big shaping factors for the next 10 years from a global economic point of view were how do we grapple with inequality and how do we grapple with the need to decarbonize? Now we have to do that while we dig out of an economic recession or decline, in some cases a depression around the world, the likes of which we haven't seen in modern economic history. So an extraordinary task ahead of us. It's a race. It's a race to zero. It's a race to an economy which could be in balance with the chemistry of the planet by mid-century. Net zero emissions is now, dictated by the science, the economic goal. How can every country, how can every company, every insurer, every asset owner, every asset manager ensure that its actions contribute to an economy which is showing net zero emissions by mid-century? What that means is that everything that goes up has to be balanced out, that we cannot continue to emit carbon pollution in the way that we have done in the past. We have to find ways to not only stop emitting it, but also have to find ways to pull it out of the atmosphere, to sequester it, either through nature-based solutions, through the activities of soil and forests and nature, or through new technologies, which would be able to take those carbon emissions and store them or transform them into new and different products. So this race to net zero by mid-century has now been joined by the European Union, by China. We are told by the Biden administration, and we wait until April the 22nd to see what a US climate action plan looks like. The race has been joined by Japan, by South Korea. All the indications are that India will join the race as well. But it's not enough to be at net zero emissions by mid-century. What we need to do is halve the amount of emissions by 2030. This is not a race we win by going slow for the next 20 years and then sprinting at the end. This is a race where we are going to have to sprint a marathon, and the marathon starts now at a sprint. The good news is that there is a remarkable mobilization, not just of countries that are now committing to this long-term goal, but we're starting to see a real understanding within the financial markets that exposure to carbon pollution is not going to be a long-term position that will produce the kind of reward and a return on investment that we seek. We're starting to see trillions of dollars under management of long-term, of pension funds, of long-term assets, and others will talk about this, that really now need to find ways to invest in clean technologies, in the clean energy transition, in the clean transportation transition. They look also for opportunities to be investing in nature if nature is part of the solution. In fact, we're almost at a point of having a green bubble as the search for a green alpha, for those green and clean technologies is so sought after. And really the projects and the companies are not quite there yet. So there are many good things that are happening. We've got an alignment at the political level of countries committed to a long-term goal. We're seeing more and more and more finance within the system, understanding that it wants to be invested in green. But we have inertia and we have incumbency. We still have a political system dominated in the short run, and in this country, certainly a political system dominated by lobbying money and other funds that are coming from those who do well under the system as it is.
I want to cut right to the chase. We have seen a convergence of climate change, race, and the coronavirus in the last year or so. And one of the articles that I wrote in Forbes last year looked at all three of those from the context of similarities and differences. And unfortunately, I find several similarities between the racial justice and equity issues that we've been facing in the last year or so, particularly in light of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery here in Georgia, the denial around climate change, and the ridiculous claims that we've seen in anti-science perspective concerning coronavirus, wearing masks and vaccines. And so it's important in formats like this to bring these issues to what I call the so what factor, the kitchen table factor. Now, I talk climate change and weather extremes all of the time. I'm called upon to testify before Congress. I've briefed the White House. I've briefed the Waffle House. I'm happy to talk at a Waffle House if anyone asks questions about weather and climate. And what I have found is that my community, meaning the science community, the weather, climate, and atmospheric scientists, we have in a way done a disservice in the messaging. And what I mean by that is the focus for too long has been on the trend lines, the anomaly charts, the graphics, and the jargon associated with warmer temperatures, average temperatures, carbon dioxide tendencies, sensitivity analysis. That's all great for the journals that I publish in or when I speak at the American Meteorological Society or the AGU. But that doesn't resonate with the public and with policymakers and decision makers. Public health is one of those key markers of the kitchen table issues that I have often talked about. There was talk several months ago about immigration issue as a national emergency. Now, while most of that was politics, I did write an article in Forbes noting that the climate crisis is indeed a national emergency. When we look at public health, agricultural productivity, infrastructure, water supply, extreme weather event, and a population within our country and around the world that represents marginalization, poverty, but yet most vulnerable to this crisis. That's the national emergency too. Yet many people don't understand that because they think climate change discussions are about polar bears or the year 2080 or some butterfly colony. All of those things are very important to me. But when you frame the issues in terms of a child experiencing extreme heat in an urban heat island exacerbated by more frequent and intense heat waves, that's a so what issue. That's a kitchen table issue. When you talk about the cost of cereal and bread increasing due to frequent and intense drought, that's a so what. That's a kitchen table issue. When you look at the perspective of increasing gas prices because a hurricane came through the Gulf of Mexico and shut down oil rigs, or a cold snap came through Texas just recently, shutting down oil production and natural gas production, driving up gas prices. Those are so what issues. And so I appreciate that the organizers of this event are focusing on this issue of public health and health in general as it relates to the climate crisis, because there are obvious issues and concerns. I wrote in an article looking at African American impacts and vulnerability to climate change several years ago. And there are obvious issues related to public health around heat and heat stress and heat morbidity and cardiovascular and air quality and upper respiratory diseases. But let's not overlook the disease issues associated with flooding and residual water after hurricanes or massive rainstorms. These carry residual public health concerns as well. And there are many other, what I would call secondary health issues that may not get the headlines immediately, but lurk in the background after extreme weather climate events. And so
climate change is already having impact on public health, on people, on communities. We only have to look at the impact of extreme weather events around the world and see the impact on human beings, on communities. That is going to accelerate in coming decades if we don't keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. That's the target. And it sounds like a little number, but actually that increase in degrees Celsius is enough to bring the planet to certain tipping points, as everyone is aware. So the question is, what do we do about this? Well, the good news is there's a role for everybody. The governments have a role, policymakers have a role, civil society has a role, because how we choose to eat, move around, plug in, the food that we consume, all of this has an impact. So the way that we spend our money, the way that we exercise our votes, all of this is actually going to have an impact. But this morning, maybe I can share a little bit about what CalPERS is doing, because you might think, well, what's a pension fund got to do with climate change? You know, this is finance. This is happening in some faraway place like Wall Street or Tokyo, or the City of London. So first of all, CalPERS is a very big pension fund. It's the largest defined benefit pension fund in the United States. And we're one of the 10 biggest asset owners in the whole of the world. So CalPERS is huge. But that also means we have nowhere to hide on an issue like climate change. We've got to be engaged in transforming the economy from where we are now to that low carbon energy sources that we need in the future. And here's why. Our pension fund is at around the $450 billion mark. That's a rather boggling amount of money. And it's invested around the world. And also it's invested for the very long term. We have to pay pensions over generations. So when you're thinking very long term, and when you're a global investor, issues like climate change become not just an environmental issue, but a financial issue. And it's not just because of the risks that climate change poses, it's also because of the opportunities. Now, where does investment fit in to solving the challenge of climate change. The first thing to say is companies are a very large source of greenhouse gas emissions. So just to give you an example, in our portfolio, we hold about 10,000 companies at the moment, listed on stock markets around the world. It's about half of our portfolio, called global equity. Out of those 10,000 companies, about 100 produce the vast bulk of the greenhouse gases. And it means, therefore, that the third largest source of global warming gases on the planet are these 100 companies. So number one, China. Number two, as a source of greenhouse gas emissions, the United States. Number three, just 100 companies. And some of these are the ones you'd expect to see, the oil companies like Shell and Exxon. But it also includes companies that are responsible for producing steel and cement and cars, vehicles for us to get around in, and also companies that are important in agriculture. So when we're thinking about the transformation of the economy, I think I was reading Bill Gates's new book over the weekend. He has this lovely way to sum it up. He says, how we move around, how we warm ourselves up, cool ourselves down, how we make things, how we plug in, and what we eat. Think of those 5 categories, and every single one of them is going to be involved in the climate change transition. So the role of investors like pension funds is really very important, because we not only put money into these companies, but we also have rights and responsibilities. Typically, as a shareholder, you have voting rights. That means that every year there's a meeting called the annual general meeting of a company, and shareholders vote to approve the directors, for example, who are going to oversee the company's strategy in the coming year. So this means that shareholders have not only got an important role because they put money into companies, but also because of their role as the owners of the equity, the shares in those companies. It gives us a responsibility as stewards. And those pension funds all around the world, like CalPERS, that are tackling climate change, think about it this way. Pension funds represent the wider community's savings. Think of it as the common wealth, the savings of the wider working community through insurance, through mortgages, through pension funds, and other forms of savings. This is the finance, which is ultimately invested in the world economy. And therefore, the role of finance can actually be extremely important in helping move this transition forward.
Wellcome is actually in the process of developing a new vision and a new strategy. And this is really an important change in the way that it's funded its science to date. Instead of funding with a vision of we fund the brightest minds, the vision now is Wellcome supports science to solve the urgent health challenges facing everyone. And the big question that has been an important consideration over the last 2 years is what are those challenges that face everybody that the trust should be investing in. And after a considerable consultation, global consultation, we're taking on 3 worldwide health challenges. That is mental health, infectious disease, which the trust is already well known for and has been very much engaged on COVID response and COVID research funding, and global heating, our climate change program. And they will also then continue to support a broad program of discovery research across a wide range of disciplines, because we know that you don't know where the future opportunities are going to emerge. You need to have open discovery by researchers that may come, new solutions may come from surprising places. Central to the new vision as well is diversity and inclusion, and in particular a research culture that promotes not only the research outcomes, but the way we do research has now become a sort of central piece of the work that we intend to fund. And then within that context, we have a strong focus on youth, and in particular, an interest in supporting increasing activities in lower and middle income countries. Now, that's the new strategy. We're right in the middle of that. So we're in a transition process, but our Planet, Our Health is very much focused on the activities in the transition, which will then lead us into the new strategy as we go forward. And taking us back to Dean Kite, who mentioned the COP26 climate change conference that will be happening in the UK, in Glasgow, in November of this year. The original was supposed to be last year. Obviously the pandemic has been a problem for that. There are a number of significant events before this year's COP26, which is the G20 and the G7, where both the pandemic and climate-related issues will likely be discussed. And then COP27 is also now on our sites, because COP27 is planned for Africa, and it will, if you like, have a different flavor, one which is much more centered around the needs of lower and middle income countries, and we're very keen to engage there. So when we heard from Dean Kite the enormous steps that have been made in terms of commitments by countries towards net zero, we have yet to see these in what are called the nationally determined commitments, where countries say actually what they're going to do and how they're going to deliver their net zero strategy. And this is just a graph that's taken from the Energy and Climate Unit, Intelligence Unit, where they show there's only 2 countries in the world that are actually achieving net zero at the moment. There are a number in the UK where they've put net zero strategies into law, but most countries and still some major emitters have not actually made those commitments yet. And so it's incredibly important that momentum is developed in the coming year as part, if you like, of the response to the pandemic and the budgets, the recovery budgets, but to make sure that we raise ambition and push these countries across the finishing line.
Okay, well, thank you. Clearly, we have a lot to discuss this morning after listening to our distinguished Bicknell speakers, Rachel Kite, Marshall Shepard, Ann Simpson, and Matto Thompson. So we've heard from the philanthropic world, science, finance community from CalPERS, and from Dean Rachel Kite from the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts. And we're going to begin shortly, but first, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our BU faculty panel, who will be reflecting with us on this recent public health conversation, tackling climate change, mitigation, or adaptation. First, I'd like to start by saying hello to Jackie Ashmore and introducing her to you. Jackie is the Executive Director of the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy and Research Associate Faculty in the Earth and Environment and the Engineering departments at BU. Her recent research has focused on how cities can continue to make gains on climate change while also addressing the public health needs and the economic rebuilding necessitated by the pandemic. Jackie weaves equity considerations throughout her work. So welcome, Jackie. Next, I'd like to introduce Patricia Fabian, who is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Health. She researches trade-offs between energy retrofits in buildings, indoor air quality and health, and co-leads a community study of heat exposure and vulnerability. Welcome, Patricia. And next, I'd like to introduce Pat Kinney, who is the inaugural Beverly Brown Professor of Urban Health at BUSPH. His work is helping cities to make the transition to a low carbon future while also becoming healthier, cleaner, and more equitable. He quantifies the health benefits of interventions to increase access to green space and bicycling and walking infrastructure. Welcome, Pat. And Greg Willenius, who is a professor in BU's Department of Environmental Health and director of our growing program on climate and health. His research is focused on assessing and providing the evidence needed to effectively reduce the many adverse health impacts of climate change. Thank you, Professor Willenius, for moderating today's event. Greg will facilitate all questions submitted through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to start submitting now. It is my pleasure to turn it over to Professor Willenius. Greg, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening to all our participants. It's great to have you here and great to be able to have this follow-up conversation after a wonderful Bicknell lecture where we heard from such provocative and stimulating conversation from world experts. Jackie, maybe I'll start with you. What did you hear in the Bicknell lecture and the comments of our guests there that really stood out for you or surprised you?
Thanks, Greg. It was a really rich discussion, and I felt that there were actually three headlines that really stood out for me. One was this emphasis on urgency, as Dean Kite said, sprinting a marathon starting now over the next 3 decades. That really captured something for me. The second thing I noted was the emphasis on everybody having a role. We need government to act, we need corporations to act, investors, insurers, asset owners. We have to be all in on this. And the final thing that struck me, and I think is massively important, was the real acknowledgement that we have to address inequity very deliberately. That has to be a priority that we put at the center of our planning and our action. So those were the headlines from my point of view.
Thank you. I completely agree. Pat, Kinney, are those the same key takeaways you thought there, or are there additional points?
Well, yeah, I think I would completely agree with what Jackie just said, and I might build on it slightly. I think throughout the Bicknell lecture, we heard about both the challenges, but also the opportunities of climate change. And I thought that the sprint of a marathon comment that Dean Kite mentioned was particularly poignant in terms of the challenge, but I also noted that she then transitioned to the opportunity, and she mentioned the idea that we're about to enter something like a green bubble, which I think is a great phrase to sort of convey the economic opportunities that are now becoming available to innovators in the business world around green technologies, but also taking that one step further about the health opportunities that are now presented by going to a future low carbon economy. And that's the kind of work that we've been looking at BU's School of Public Health. That is the clean air, the clean water, the healthier, more walkable cities that are being developed as we transition to a low carbon future.
That's great, thank you. And Patricia, what were the key takeaways for you?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. And I agree completely with what Jackie and Pat said. Building a little bit on opportunities, I felt really important for us to change the conversation, right? Everything about climate change that you hear is very doomsday. And if we can reframe this, opportunities, obviously financial, as we heard from the panelists, but opportunities for equitable decisions, right, to reduce disparities. We can frame the conversation that way. And around health, which people care about very much. It doesn't matter where you live or what your socioeconomic status is or what your opportunities have been. That the kitchen table topics, as Marshall Shepard discussed, right? Like what can you bring and how can you reframe the conversation in ways that people will care?
That's great. So equity was a theme that continually, repeatedly came up in that conversation, appropriately so. And so I wonder if we could dig into equity a little bit, and I'll open this up to anybody that wants to answer. But can we sort of summarize why climate change is an equity issue and a health equity issue in particular, and where does that point us to in terms of solutions?
I can talk well, Pat.
Please.
Okay, I'll jump in quick and then let Patricia hopefully bring it down to more of a local ground level. But on a global scale, I mean, climate change is one of the most striking, probably the most striking example of a global inequity. If you look at the map around the world of where the greenhouse gases have been generated over the last century, it's all in the north. It's all Europe and the United States, now China. If you look at the impacts on health around the world, they're all in Africa, South Asia, and so it's just a really striking example of a global inequity. And that kind of inequity that we're seeing on a global scale also plays out at the very local scale. And Patricia's been doing some really interesting research on that question.
So I can pick up on that. And as Pat says, we have a heat vulnerability study that we're working on in Chelsea and East Boston, which are communities that have been impacted very much by COVID. They're communities that have a lot of different environmental stressors and a lot of different racial ethnic characteristics that make them vulnerable. And they are not, similarly sort of equipped to deal with the consequences of climate change. So whether it's flooding or homes that aren't well insulated or ability to pay for air conditioning when it's hot. So, it plays out almost the same, right? It mirrors what's happening globally. The countries that are most contributing to greenhouse gas emissions are the ones that are best equipped to deal with climate consequences. And the same, if you go state or local to a community, it's happening exactly the same way.
So add to that statistically it's shown that if you're a low-income community, often with a higher proportion of residents of color, you're more likely to be close to a highway and therefore constantly exposed to the emissions and pollutants associated with that. You're more likely to be situated close to a fossil fuel power generation plant with similar implications for air pollution, which obviously leads to higher instances of asthma and any number of other issues. So a lot gets intertwined.
So how do we unwind that from a solutions framework? So I love the optimism that all three of you expressed of how we need to sort of pivot from doom and gloom to solutions and action. And how does equity, how do we take an equity perspective to do that, as fairly and justly as possible?
So I was impressed by one thing that the speakers talked about, which maybe wasn't in the highlights, but focusing on the last mile, I think is what they called it, right? So when you think about investing in who's going to be getting weatherized, who's going to be having access to solar panels or clean green energy, rather than sort of first investing in the higher income communities, which are really the communities that have the voice and the power to sort of advocate for that, or apply for resources more quickly and grants, et cetera. That if we turned our focus to, start first with the communities that usually get attention last and get resources last, if we kind of flip that, that we would get our biggest bang for our buck, right? For both from an equity perspective, from a health perspective, et cetera. So.
And I just add that I think, as we look to serve those communities in various ways, whether it's investing in energy efficiency and affordable housing or investing in clean energy for those solutions, there's a great opportunity for those communities to build their green workforce and for it to be an economic opportunity for them too. So that's the other dimension I flag.
I would also just point out that Jackie's Energy Institute at BU has been, just as one example, mapping out how Boston can achieve its zero carbon goal for 2050. And as part of that, we've been examining what that might mean for air quality and how those air quality benefits from a low carbon future could distribute across across different groups. There are huge inequities in air pollution exposures around the Boston area, as there are around the country. But encouragingly, some of the low carbon technologies, especially around transportation, can potentially really help alleviate those inequities.
Great. So Pat, staying up with you for a second, a huge issue that Dr. Marshall Shepard raised was sort of these kitchen table issues. And, he emphasized how health and public health was really one of these kitchen table issues. Now, can you talk a little bit about sort of how that fits into your work? And in particular, a lot of your research is on climate co-benefits. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by climate co-benefits and why that's important in the broader conversation on climate action?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to do that. As I was kind of alluding to, vaguely in my earlier comments, low carbon strategies, the kind of strategies around our energy system that need to be adopted, in this sprint of a marathon by 2050. Most of them involve reducing emissions from fossil fuel combustion sources like transportation, power generation, buildings, et cetera. And in that case, we're concerned about the carbon emissions, the carbon dioxide emissions, and sometimes methane emissions. But those same sources also generally are major sources of pollutants that are directly harmful to human health. In particular, these very tiny aerosol particles, we call them PM 2.5, which we know are killing thousands of Americans every year due to chronic cardiovascular diseases because of the high levels that we've been exposed to over the years. By taking action to reduce carbon emissions, we can also make really significant improvements in the air quality related to PM 2.5. And that's actually the kind of analysis that was embedded in the Clean Power Plan that the Obama administration proposed towards the end of the administration, which I think is being revived now under Biden. That the sort of low carbon strategy around power generation was going to be generating tremendous benefits for human health through cleaner air. And so those kinds of benefits, I think, are really important for us to make clear to people so that they understand that when we're taking decisions that are good for the planet and in the long term are also extremely beneficial for people living right here, right now.
That's great. So immediate benefits of climate action, both in the long term and in the next 20, 30, 50, 100 years, but also the health benefits of those actions today. So Jackie, when you engage with stakeholders at all levels, from the very local to the global. So how important is that message of both health broadly and sort of climate co-benefits for health specifically in the conversations that you have with partners around the world?
I think it is helpful. I mean, one thing I would say is that I feel that there's an ever-growing number of people who really understand the urgency of climate action just for the sake of the planet. But understanding the health implications, I think, just adds one more compelling reason. And I guess I'd add that, I think one of the things that is sometimes complicated is when the issue of climate action becomes heavily politicized, right? And people kind of splinter into different groups according to their politics. But I think to me, health can be very helpful in reducing the politicization, and you can kind of get around some of the drivers that drive people into different corners. So I believe it's really compelling from that perspective.
That's great. And Patricia, you're actually speaking with people in the community. And so what works at the kitchen table? Like what climate change can feel like this big overwhelming topic, and people have, they're under economic pressures, they're under sort of, it's been a very stressful time now, but obviously if in many communities those conditions have existed for a long time. What do you hear at the community level? Like what works in the people you talk to?
Yeah, I think the first thing that works is actually sitting at the kitchen table with the communities that are getting impacted. So just listening, right, and sort of not making assumptions about what may be important to them or what may impact them. And even from a solutions perspective, I think that's really critical because buy-in for solutions will depend on how much people sort of care and are impacted. So one challenge that I've seen, for example, in our communities, not challenge, just sort of, let's put it in as an opportunity, is that cities may have good intentions and policies that they want to implement that maybe are about reducing, say, urban heat island or thinking about increasing green space. But then when you talk to a community, maybe their issue is, having a tree might cool down the city overall, right? But for a person living indoors in maybe a smaller house that's not well insulated and doesn't have air conditioning or doesn't have ability to pay for air conditioning, their issues are, economic and about cooling their indoor space and putting a tree and sort of voting for a tree or supporting a policy. And so of course, they would love to have parks, right? But that park isn't going to necessarily change the environment in which they spend 90% of their time. And so I think bringing to the table sort of community concerns and listening, right, to them, and then kind of combining that with what, say, cities and policies are trying to do, and then sort of at a broader scale globally, what we're trying to do, having those conversations with everyone is critical, and bringing communities to the table is critical so that we can learn about and again, get buy-in and actually have implementable solutions.
Do you hear a difference even between Chelsea and East Boston in terms of sort of community priorities or buy-in, or which issues resonate more? Or, how generalizable are sort of the thoughts that, if we hear from one community, how broadly does that apply?
So in the particular case of Chelsea and East Boston, and for those of you who haven't been to Boston, it's a smallish city in terms of area, say compared to, I don't know, Houston or sort of other Chicago, other London, other metropolitan areas. Chelsea and East Boston, the makeup of the community is very similar, I would say. So, and it's very small area for both of them. So I would say that we're hearing similar concerns. I would say where the huge difference is that East Boston is a neighborhood within the city of Boston, and city of Boston has a climate action plan, and cooling centers, for example, are a good example. City of Chelsea is just starting to think about those things. They're not resourced in the same way, right? They're a much smaller city, still a city. Again, like cooling centers is a good example. There haven't been any cooling centers. And so I think that the disconnect there is really more about the governance of the two places, and also sort of the fragmentation that they're so close together that you can walk, right, from one neighborhood to the other, and sort of the resources that are available and the thought that has been put into climate preparedness. They're on either side of a water body, so sort of at risk for flooding, next to a lot of environmental stressors, sort of, storage of salt for the winter, storage of jet fuel for the airport. Yet city of Boston, again, has put a lot more resources and thought compared to the city of Chelsea. So I would say that's the difference, not so much from the community concerns, but really more kind of how well resourced the cities where people live, residents of East Boston, compared to Chelsea.
That's a great point in terms of the context is pretty different, the political maybe context there and the resource context. So and Jackie, this sort of brings up an issue that, all of our speakers of the Bicknell lecture talked about sort of, how we can all play a role, how we all have a role to play. And in fact, a lot of the climate conversation has been around individual responsibility and individual action. If only we biked a bit more, if only we composted a bit more, if only we ate a bit more red meat or a bit less red meat. So can you talk about sort of the role of individual action versus sort of government action and different levels of government?
Absolutely. One of the comments that I thought was great, I think it was in the Q&A session of the Bicknell lecture, was you raising that when we individually act differently, it might just have a small effect in the grand scheme of things, but it helps to normalize something different. And I do believe that's important. And I kind of appreciate that, when I kind of do something differently because I'm thinking about climate, that becomes a chance for me to talk to people I'm with, whether it's family members or friends. I'm doing this differently because I'm thinking about climate change. But I guess, we really need systemic change, right? And that has to go beyond simply what we each do in our everyday lives. One of the other things that I felt came through in the Bicknell lecture was we have a good number of governments, corporations, various entities who have made pledges, often around net zero by 2050. But a piece that is important is transparency around are those entities making progress? And I think we're really starting to see a lot more scrutiny around that. I'm definitely hearing, just a lot of questions. We convened 21 city leaders from the US and the UK last month, many of whom had committed to climate action. And a lot of the questions there too were about, we need to communicate the progress we're making year by year. COP26 is actually asking cities to consider signing up to a pledge called Race to Zero, and that would provide them with some support in terms of learning from each other, but they do require those cities to share, what progress are you making, put data out there so that people can really understand. And I think we're seeing this in the financial world increasingly also. So, individual action is great, but we need a whole lot more than that. And we need to vote according to climate principles when those leaders hold office. We need to, keep reminding them, like, we care about climate change. We want you to act on climate change. We have to hold their feet to the fire.
Yeah, and Pat, again, you work in various contexts ranging from, our own backyard in the city of Boston, all the way to some, very large studies you've done in China. Can you talk a little bit as well about sort of the what you feel sort of the role of cities versus national, like city government versus national government versus global, these large global compacts?
Yeah, that's a good question, Greg. Interesting, when I came to BU 4 years ago from Columbia, one of the things I was thinking about it and looking at the landscape of climate action at the time is that really in the United States, cities were really taking the lead, cities and regions, but especially cities. So over the past few decades, when the federal government has had a difficult time politically really tackling this issue, meanwhile cities on the ground have really taken the lead. So I think currently, I think that's where the action is, at least domestically, is at the city level. Hopefully that will change. We'll start to see more collective action at higher levels of government. But cities are really where the rubber meets the road in a way, and they're being impacted by sea level rise and coastal storms and heat waves. The heat island effect, really affects cities especially, and so it makes sense for them to take action to try to prevent those impacts and to adapt and to build resilience, but at the same time to take a lead role in reducing emissions so that we can get our levels of CO2 down and limit the warming hopefully below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So yeah, cities are really taking the lead. And I might turn the table back to you, Greg, and I'm curious to know what you think about these themes that came up during the Bicknell lecture, how they're informing the way you're thinking about the new climate program at the School of Public Health. What sorts of themes can we sort of take on from a public health perspective to really deal with those questions?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. I think it's a great opportunity to talk a little bit about our program in climate and health, and really I see that program as bringing together a number of you that sort of predate me here at BU. I've been at BU for about 1.5 years now, as well as a large community of very dedicated, passionate students, staff, postdoctoral fellows, and And when I say students, I mean everybody from undergraduates to doctoral students have, there's just an incredible amount of energy. And so the goal is really to bring people together to maximize their effectiveness in tackling this issue. And from my perspective, there's certainly a lot we already know about climate change, but health is a non-controversial issue. Everybody wants to be healthier. And so if we can frame this, move the conversation from this is an environmental problem, which of course it is, but to this is a health problem. And as our Bicknell speaker said, as you guys have reiterated today, this is a problem of here and now. It's not about, as both Marshall Shepard and Ed Maybach say, it's not about penguins and polar bears. That's not going to drive us to action. It's really about the health of our loved ones, our communities, our families. And, for example, our kids, it's like, what's the world we're going to leave our kids in terms of their risk for asthma, their risk for being injured or displaced by a hurricane or a wildfire as these events become more and more severe. So these are very personal issues, I feel, for me, and I think for many people that might not otherwise be inclined to engage on this topic, that there's a real opportunity to say, hey, this threatens the things that matter to you. If you like to go to the beach in the summer, that might get a little bit harder because there's a little bit less beach each year in the many places that we like to go. And some, of our recreational waters are closed for algal blooms more often than they used to be because we're not taking good care of what's going into those waters. If you like skiing in New England, that might be a little harder in the years to come because the warmer nights make it harder to make snow and make those ski hills less financially viable. And so I think the conversation has to be about what do people care about, and then thinking about how climate change affects the things that they care about most. And almost everybody I've ever talked to cares deeply about their health and the health of their families. So that's where I think health really interfaces. And I think there's a lot we can do in terms of the research and action that we take to really emphasize those connections between climate and health. So Patricia, back to you. So you do a lot of work in cities. And so Pat mentioned that cities is sort of where I think you said the rubber meets the road. This is where action's happening. And so give me the so what of that. Like, does it matter what cities do? Is that a small part of the pie, a big part of the pie now and into the future?
Well, so echoing what Pat said, first of all, echoing what Jackie said, that it's urgent and there's a role for everybody. So individuals, communities, cities, regions, countries, right? Sort of global organizations. So yes, absolutely, cities matter. Echoing what Pat said, cities have really been at the forefront of saying, even if there isn't sort of federal guidance or oversight support, this matters. Companies have done the same thing, right? It doesn't matter whether, we're in Paris Agreement or not, this is our goal, right? Some of it altruistic, some of it because truly it's affecting financial ability to say, be able to harvest sugarcane or chocolate if that's what you make. The workers being impacted and factories being impacted by extreme weather events, et cetera. So yes, there's absolutely a role for cities. I don't know that it's more important than all the other kind of fractions. Everyone has to be part of it.
So all of the above. So, we often frame climate action as, we have to change something, and change is hard for people. And people often think of sort of what they lose during that change. So, okay, now I'm not going to be able to drive, and as an exaggeration, I won't be able to drive anywhere anymore, or I'll have to pay much more for my electricity. So, but there's definitely some very positive changes. So I wonder, Jackie, if you can think of examples of how these changes actually bring not just sort of the long-term benefits, but back to sort of, besides the health benefits that sort of work on average, but like, how can climate action positively impact our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I truly believe that, if we sell climate action as the equivalent of trying to get our kids to eat their vegetables, it's not going to work. And so I really believe in this positive framing. One thing I would point to is we all rely on our cars so much, right? And so many of our streets have been designed for cars primarily, and then cyclists and pedestrians, they just kind of have to deal with that situation. What we are seeing is increasing redesign of our streets with rapid transit for bus, lanes for rapid transit bus, also thinking about cyclists and pedestrians. And the thing I'd say is, when you get into the habit of not jumping into your car, but jumping on your bike or walking, it's great, right? And you can just have a journey where instead of feeling like, wow, I just spent like 20 minutes sitting in traffic feeling stressed behind the wheel of my car, you can be like, hey, I found a great bike route and I just zoomed along and I felt safe, and my mental health feels good and I got some physical exercise too. So I think that's one example, but there are others too, for sure.
Pat, any thoughts on that?
I would just echo what Jackie said, in that it's any investments that we make in improving access for bicycles and pedestrians as a mode of transport around the city, especially for the shorter trips that people take, will reap very large benefits for human health. One of our PhD students, Matt Rafeman, just recently published a paper where he did an initial analysis of some future low carbon transportation scenarios for the northeastern states in the United States. And what he found is that the health benefits from improved cardiovascular health by getting people just to move around a little bit more, to have more opportunities for biking and walking, can be really large, and can be as large or larger than the air quality benefits that come from a clean transportation system. So I think that's really an important future goal. I think it's great that Jackie emphasized the transportation sector, because there's also the rapid transition to electric vehicles, which don't necessarily help us with the roadway safety question, but they do help us with the air quality problem in cities. We've tolerated having these pollution sources, traveling along the streets, right along our sidewalks, right by schools and playgrounds. Every single car and every single truck emitting, millions of tiny toxic particles. As we move to electric vehicles, which is happening fairly rapidly, we're gonna eliminate that local source of air pollution in cities. Now, some of the energy generation may be taken up by power plants, which also pollute. But I think part of the benefit is that they're far away. They're not like right next to the playground. But also, we're moving to renewable energy sources for generating that electricity. So I really think that that transition to electric transportation, along with more investment in biking and pedestrian infrastructure, are really going to transform cities in the future.
That's great. Thank you. One of the examples that sticks in my mind is about weatherization, particularly of our residences. So in Massachusetts, we have a program mandated and then promoted by the utilities for increasing energy efficiency in our homes. And they come to your home and they blow in insulation and so forth at a minimal cost. And the pitch is, yes, this will help you save energy and it'll help the environment, but most importantly, you'll feel more comfortable in your home at winter. And it's sort of that example of, do something that's good for the environment, but that doesn't motivate as many people as we need. And so, think about how we do this in a way that improves my comfort, my well-being. And in fact, we've had our house insulated and it does feel more comfortable in the winter because you don't have those cold drafts. So I love that example of sort of making it win-win. So I want to pivot a little bit to the COVID pandemic. Obviously, this has been a very long year for everybody, and particularly harsh for many people and concentrated in certain communities. So, and Patricia, you mentioned that both Chelsea and East Boston were particularly hard hit by the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what the, are these two orthogonal, two different events that are unrelated, climate change and COVID, or what's the overlap between them, or at least the lessons learned from one that apply to the other?
I think what's been really clear is that vulnerabilities that are related to inequities, sort of historical, structural racism, climate justice, which I would love to talk to a little bit about as well, that made communities vulnerable to COVID. So irrespective of sort of the root causes and whether climate change and COVID are related, it didn't matter, right? And it doesn't matter if it's a hurricane or a wildfire or a pandemic. The communities that are most vulnerable to any kind of extreme event, health problem, etc. So I think that's what kind of got highlighted. And if there's anything positive to come out of that, is that it really brought that to the forefront of the conversation, that all these conversations that we've been hearing about inequities and investments or disinvestments in neighborhoods, historical redlining and how that has played into housing quality and opportunities for communities, that it makes communities and people less resilient to anything that's coming down the pipeline, whether it's a health problem or a climate problem. So I think that's I think something that's been really highlighted. And again, we were starting our heat study in January, and then in March, everything that we were thinking about that was related to heat vulnerability and why we were working in a community that had older housing stock, and it just pivoted to COVID. It all applied 100% to who was being impacted by COVID, who was being laid off, who didn't have financial resources to pay for things.
I just add, I think there was one point where the overlap was particularly visible, which is that people in communities that are vulnerable because of poor air quality leading to underlying chronic health conditions, they were the people who were most vulnerable to COVID. And so there you really saw the environmental implications for people's health, then unfortunately meaning that they were especially hard hit by COVID-19.
Just building a little bit from that, even expanding the idea of vulnerability, right? So if you think about having asthma, right, being an asthmatic, or blood pressure, or being diabetic, and being older, risk factors for COVID, for severe COVID, there's a lot of vulnerabilities that you don't traditionally think about, right? Things like being an essential worker, having to take public transportation, being exposed to air pollution, which might make your expression of receptors that pick up COVID be higher. So it kind of these complex also relationships that you wouldn't traditionally think would make you vulnerable to COVID, but that were. And as Jackie said, it's historically communities exposed to high levels of air pollution. So
I thought several of the speakers in the Bicknell discussion highlighted this juxtaposition of these two issues. Both Rachel Kite and Marshall Shepard did nice jobs of looking at parallels. I think that they also illustrate the political challenges, the trusting of science questions that sort of plague both the COVID issue as well as taking climate change seriously, and so those are really important, as well as the equity issues that have been highlighted just now. I also wanted to mention, I think there's an interesting learning or a lesson sort of from the COVID for the general public, which is that little tiny particles can be deadly, and that masks and avoidance of exposure to tiny particles, in this case, COVID, it's an infectious virus, but there's lots of tiny particles that come out of exhaust pipes and power plant stacks that are also killing us, maybe more slowly than COVID does. And I think hopefully raising awareness about little aerosol particles and the way they're affecting our health, I think can translate hopefully to taking more seriously the air pollution problem that we still face in the US and throughout the world especially, and the benefits that we can achieve in terms of air quality if we do tackle the climate change problem in an aggressive way. We can really solve climate change as well as making our air healthier, and we can have longer, healthier lives as a result.
Yeah, I think one of the things I definitely saw was sort of a bit of resurgence in science. I mean, the investments, the amount of discussion and investments around ventilation in schools is like a conversation I wish we could have had in the general public 10 years ago, 20 years ago, right? And so you know, not all communities obviously have been able to improve the ventilation in their schools, but I think many have at least assessed what are the challenges in doing so. And if we could invest more in improving the air quality in our schools, that's got to go a long way, both for the health of our kids and the education. I mean, there's links between the quality of the air in schools and how well kids learn, how well kids do on tests. So we've been hearing a lot about that in recent times, and so incredibly important. And so what about the public health response? Like, you know, these are both, so Dean Kite made the point, these are both sort of slow moving disasters that have been sort of coming for a long time. I might argue that our public health response was good, but presumably could have been better. So how do we take lessons from sort of the public health response to COVID, and are there lessons there to be applied to climate change?
I think, you know, one of the things that was incredible as, you know, March turned to April last year, and we all realized, my goodness, you know, there's a lot to understand here. You know, look at how Fauci became an icon, right? And everybody was tuning in to what's Fauci saying now. And he was just an incredible communicator who won tremendous trust. And I suppose as we kind of think about the climate analog, and like, can we find like the climate version of Dr. Fauci? Wouldn't that be incredible to have somebody that, you know, not everybody respects and listens to, but an overwhelming group of people do, and somebody who can really communicate, you know, this is what we know the problem is, this is how we can collectively respond and keep ourselves safe. So, you know, I think that communication piece and finding the right compelling person to speak to a broad swathe of the population could help a lot if we can find that person. So my eyes are open to think about who that person might be.
Yeah, that I think that's great. And there was a similar, you know, very key presence, I believe, in British Columbia. The head public health official in British Columbia was widely celebrated as sort of for clear delivery of accurate messaging. And I think one of the things that we see is sort of the importance of communication with the public. And I think that, you know, oftentimes as scientists, we're not necessarily trained in doing that or necessarily very good at it. And so, you know, the example of I think the New York Times has had a couple of pieces on how sort of you know, we communicate vaccines as like, oh, well, you know, we still have these concerns, whereas like we should be saying, hey, the vaccines they just work and they're safe and they're effective and just go do it. But as scientists, we tend to, you know, couch everything in cautionary language and be very sort of conservative with our approach. And there's a time and a place for that in science, and there's a time and a place for sort of just clear messaging. So Patricia, I didn't give you a chance to respond to that overlap between COVID and climate change and the public health response. Do you want to comment on that?
I think we have a great opportunity because of COVID to bring health in the conversation and inequality into the conversation, because COVID stopped our world, right? And really said health of everyone matters. It's things we knew and we talked about, but it really brought to light that if we don't pay attention to the health of everyone, both you know, health, economic health, etc., society comes to a standstill. And so I think in the same way, it would be great to take kind of that leverage. Also, health is in the consciousness of people now, right? In ways that it wasn't before. You mentioned indoor air quality. We've been for 20 years trying to make people care about indoor air quality and health and how it impacts asthma and how it matters more in low-income housing, which is smaller and has gas stoves and poor ventilation, et cetera. We can talk about it now and people will actually know what we're talking about, which they didn't before, and pay attention to try and come up with solutions. So I think that that is a good intersection of saying, okay, we've raised consciousness because of this other big problem, right? How can we move that to say, hey, well, you're still thinking about this. All of these things also apply to climate.
Wonderful. Pat, any closing thoughts?
Just very quickly, I think the lesson we've learned from COVID is that timing really matters in terms of the public health response. If we had locked down and taken the disease more seriously early in March last year, or even February, we might have seen a much different trajectory over the coming year. I think likewise with climate change, of course, the time scale of climate change is much longer than, it's not a year, it's maybe 100 years, but the quicker we take it on and really take action, the better it will be in 5 decades, 6 decades, when our grandchildren inherit the world and have to deal with what we've left them as a legacy.
Wonderful. Jackie, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thought I have from the pandemic is, imagine we had been told last January, like, you're going to have to just spend a year working from home. You don't get to go on vacation. You're not flying in planes. You're not really seeing people. It would have just felt like a totally alien scenario, right? And when we had to, we made big change. Now, I'm not saying we want to be making kind of similar changes for climate change, because obviously it has been very uncomfortable and remains uncomfortable. And we all want to get back to some kind of normality. But yeah, we can make really big changes when we need to. And I hope that as we come out of the pandemic, as we all get vaccinated and move towards herd immunity, I hope we'll really be thoughtful about not simply reverting to pre-pandemic life, but deliberate about, are there pieces of what we've been doing in the pandemic that we actually want to hold on to? And do we hold on to some pieces because we know that those changes were good for the environment and good for our health, as well as required in the pandemic? So I hope we'll just be really deliberate about thinking about the changes we make as we revert, and the other changes we'll need to make to address climate change too.
I love that message. What I hear you saying is that change is necessary. And if we act in time, we can actually control the narrative of that change and make the changes that are most beneficial to us rather than have them be imposed because of pure necessity. So thank you, Jackie Ashmore, Pat Kinney, and Patricia Fabian. Fantastic conversation. Thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you to all our participants for joining us wherever you are. We hope to continue the conversation. Please feel free to engage with us. Our emails and websites are all easily findable, so please do reach out if you need it. And Joe, I turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Greg. And I'd just like to say, on behalf of all the alumni and friends on today's call, a very special thank you to all of our faculty experts for leading us through this important discussion. Clearly, Pat, timing really matters. The timing is now. COVID-19 was our wake-up call. We had a full year to learn, to experience this, and to realize there is no return to the old normal. We move ahead. So in that spirit, as part of our 45th anniversary year, the School of Public Health will continue to bring our community together to celebrate these 45 years of research, scholarship, and practice. Public health conversations bring speakers together to engage in thoughtful conversations about the pressing issues of public health, from anti-racism as health policy to tackling climate change, which we discussed today, from women in science to inclusion in a digital world. These are free and open to the global community, designed to inform, stimulate, and encourage groundbreaking discussion. Thousands of participants attend in real time, and many others view the programming after the fact in our archives. I invite all of you joining today to continue this conversation and continue engaging with our fantastic School of Public Health at Boston University. Thank you for joining us today, and have a healthy day.